I had vowed I would never go to a church with a screen in the sanctuary, or that was so big. And I came one time and heard Davis Chapel and signed up. And I was at a smaller church. I was actually at St. Augustine's Chapel. I grew up Methodist, and then I've wandered a good bit, landed in Episcopalian for a good while, and then I've come back to my roots here, which I love. But even at that smaller place, I couldn't really find my community. And I think we do a better job of that here because we have to try so hard, we're so big. You know, like I think if you can't really find your group here, then maybe I don't know, I just think chances are you can find your group here. That's what I think. So our first, a mutual friend told me to go meet Carol Bumbelow when I got here, and I did. And we hit it off and are good friends now. And she encouraged me to do some of what I do for the church. So I've done some stuff at the women's retreat. I've hosted some workshops here. And what I do sounds pretty nebulous, but it's kind of a thing. I help people tell the stories they need to tell. And that can be for yourself, it can be for you and the divine, it can be for your family, or it can be for the world. I work a lot with older adults, helping them tell their life stories. And I work a lot with people who are grieving. I do some work with a live hospice. Because I think writing helps everything. Maybe not, especially if you don't want to publish, but pretty close to that, right? And there are different kinds of hats to wear for that kind of work, right? I'm really tonight about, and listening is a big part of that, right? And so when I trained in Stephen Minisgtry, and then when I trained later, which would have been probably about 15 years ago, and then when I trained in spiritual direction, which was in 2016, I finished that training. We talked a lot about holy listening, which y'all already know what that is. You're doing it when you see people as Stephen ministers. So I don't know what I'm going to be able to offer you tonight that you don't already know. But I'll just give you a few examples of how it's worked in my life. And I'm going to have story time and read to you a little bit. Okay? And feel free to ask any questions you want to ask. So I really, I'd already been in the writing and editing and publishing world. I'm a law school dropout. So I ran across the parking lot at Ole Miss to see if the journalism school would take me, and then I went back to law school and dropped out. Because you don't drop out in my family, you had to have a plan B. So I got my plan B, loved journalism school, knew I was not tough enough to be a hard news reporter. If you want to come tell me why you embezzled all the money, I'll take your story, but I'm not trying to. It's not tough enough for that. So it's worked out. I've done work in nonprofit development. I've done writing for some magazines. I've had some pieces in books. I've done some editing. It's just it's been a piecemeal career, but it's suited me well. But in the last 10 or 15 years or so, I've really become obsessed with helping people tell their life stories. And it's a really good way to do life review, y'all. You know, you can see what you've already done, be reminded, and you can also see what you might want to get done before it's too late. So I call it telling your life story before it's too late. So that we can also encourage all of you to write your obituaries today if you haven't, but that's another lecture. Because that's also a great way to look at what you've done, and it's one of the few things you can control about the end, right? So, but where listening comes in for me, and hearing that phrase, holy listening, which is used a lot in spiritual direction. And I think it's St. Benedict, it's in one of these books I'm going to read a little bit from, talks about listening with the ear of the heart. And I like to think I'm smart, so I like to try to figure things out. And learning to let go of that and just listen and be with people in need has been a challenge for me and a huge gift. So really all we're talking about really is what y'all probably already are doing, just listening. And I know I'll get asked sometimes, what is spiritual direction? How does it differ from counseling and coaching and things like that? And one of the main differences is we're not trying to think of things to tell you to do or to try or to let go of. We're just hearing your story. Just hearing your story. And I first realized that this might be something I cared about when I would visit my mother back in Mississippi. I'm originally from Jackson, Mississippi. And she lived in a senior living community after my father died. And my mother had never liked being alone. So she, we didn't tie her to the roof of the car and take her out there. She wanted to go, she asked to go, you know, it was a good situation for her. She would not have done well living by herself for the 16 years that she outlived my father. And so my two sisters and I, we would work so hard to get her things we thought she needed, like, you know, Alfred Dunner clothing. Y'all know Alfred Dunner, the matching things and the SAS shoes. You know, we'd be so happy when we got something that she could use. And we'd send her little happies and stuff like that. But I'm telling you, y'all, and I would go down there about every 2 months. I did that for well over a decade. But every time I went, what I saw over and over again with little groups of people in the hallway, with people in the dining room, with people in front of the fireplace, all those people wanted was somebody to listen to them. They didn't really need the new clothes or the shoes. I mean, I'm sure it made them happy to get a, you know, happy in the mail, a gift in the mail. But it really started kind of hurting my heart. It would especially be older women that I would see. And sometimes I would just be talking to my mother and one of her friends in the hallway, and then slowly, I mean, like 8 other people would come, you know. And I don't even think they needed to know what it was about. So I do think it's the sharing of our stories that saves us. And I think that's true whether you're a corporate entity or a nonprofit or a fellow churchgoer or a student minister or a friend, because somebody needs to know they're not alone. Now, you may know that on one level, but I really need to be reminded at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm churning up about something that I didn't do right, that I should have done, the state of the world, whatever it might be, my personal crosses to bear, right? We've all got something. And I don't think we're meant to compare those somethings, because everybody's got something that's hard. And I think, of course, you see that with Stephen Minisgtry, right? And so I think being able to, where we come from a culture of doers, right? That's not news. But I think when you're able just to sit with somebody and to hear their story, it's one of the most life-giving things you can do for people. So I want to read you a little, a short story from here. This is Kitchen Table Wisdom. If you don't know this book, it's lovely. And Phil took some pictures of the books, right? Yeah. This is called Just Listen. I suspect that the most basic and powerful way to connect to another person is to listen, just listen. Perhaps the most important thing we ever give each other is our attention, and especially if it's given from the heart. When people are talking, there's no need to do anything but receive them. Just take them in, listen to what they're saying, care about it. Most times, caring about it is even more important than understanding it. Most of us don't value ourselves or our love enough to know this. It has taken me a long time to believe in the power of simply saying, I'm sorry, when someone is in pain, and meaning it. And this part about, when people are talking, there's no need to do anything but receive them. When I was trained to be a hospice volunteer, I was really worried I wasn't going to do it right. I was really bugging the trainer about it. I was so scared I wasn't going to do it right. And pretty quickly I learned that what you needed to do was just show up. So I think sometimes we make this too hard on ourselves, or I'll speak for myself, I make it too hard on myself, thinking I have to not only hear the issue, think about the issue, have a resource for the issue, take her to the resource for the issue, help him make, that kind of thing. And so that's one thing we have to watch ourselves as spiritual directors, is that we don't do a lot of that. Now, if they need to be referred out to a therapist, or if they say to me, I want to know about this, then that's different. So when all right, let me finish this, sorry. And I'm kind of a wanderer, so you have to watch me. Okay, Cheryl, you'll have to bring me in. Just have to bring me in. One of my patients told me that when she tried to tell her story, people often interrupted her to tell her that they had once had something just like that happen to them. Suddenly, her pain became a story about themselves. Eventually, she stopped talking to most people. It was just too lonely. We connect through listening. When we interrupt what someone is saying to let them know what we understand, we move the focus of attention to ourselves. When we listen, they know we care. Many people with cancer talk about the relief of having someone just listen. I have even learned to respond to someone crying by just listening. In the old days, I used to reach for the tissues, until I realized that passing a person a tissue may be just another way to shut them down, to take them out of their experience of sadness and grief. Now I just listen. When they have cried all they need to cry, they find me still there. This simple thing has not been that easy to learn. It certainly went against everything I'd been taught since I was very young. I thought people listened only because they were too timid to speak or did not know the answer. And I'm telling y'all, I love to know the answer, so I really have to watch this. A loving silence often has far more power to heal and to connect than the most well-intentioned words. And the part about the tissues brings up something for me that happens in my work when I lead small groups around telling their stories. And a lot of times, hard things come up, right? I think you need community to tell your hard stories. I think you can write about your perfect children and your blemish-free life on your own. But I think you need somebody in the room with you when you've got something real hairy to write about. And in the training I took to do that kind of work, we were encouraged actually not, when somebody starts crying, to run over and hug them or give them a bunch of tissues or candy or whatever, and just let them get it all out. Certainly we can offer comfort later. We can, you might not know how they feel about being touched, right? They might have real issues with that, so that kind of thing. So sometimes I think it's looked harsh to my new people in my writing groups, but it's really helpful for the other person to have that freedom and that space that they can trust is compassionate enough to hold that without thinking, what am I going to say, what am I going to do, how can I help? Really, you're helping by showing up. So when I did my Stephen Minisgtry training and the role play, right? Did y'all have to do role play? I can't stand it. I'll try to think of a few things I like before this is over. I sound kind of like a negative Nelly, but I'm not, am I, Jane? I'm not, am I? So, you got to sign. I was the listener, and I was supposed to be, the roles they give you on the cards. So I was supposed to be real judgmental, which suited me perfectly. And the guy I was working with, who was becoming a friend of mine, he was supposed to admit to something, that he was horrified about that he'd done, and he had cheated on his wife, and something like that. So because I'm supposed to overreact and not do the good thing, I really just let him have it, because I'm not impressed. I'm acting like well, it turns out that guy had actually done that.
Oh my gosh.
So I mean, we worked it out. We were role playing. But it was so easy for me to become morally indignant, So I think every time we visit with a person, every time I see somebody in spiritual direction, every time we have a meaningful, deep conversation, it's another time to practice. So I know y'all are already doing this. I really don't know why I'm here, but I'm glad to be here. And I just want you to know that I've seen that kind of listening that's all about just receiving the story and not about what the comment back is or what you're going to do next to help them has changed my life. And I know y'all are changing other people's lives with that, just being able to listen. So I'm just going to recount it for you. So she's a doctor, Rachel, no, I mean, and writes beautifully, really accessible. And she writes a story about a time when a patient was telling her something really hard to hear. It was not about her illness, it was not about her medical situation, just something in her personal life. And Dr. Remen and the woman went on and on about how upset she was about something her children had done, and how she didn't know how to help, she couldn't believe they were acting or whatever. And Dr. Remen just said light when she would pause, just like, I hear you. Women went back to it, more and more the same, and Dr. Remen goes, right. And finally the woman does it one more time, and she's talking about how misbehaving her team has been. And she looks at Dr. Remen and she said, yeah, that's right, I was pretty rambunctious as a kid too. So she got there on her own. Dr. Remen didn't have to do one thing to help her get there except let her know she'd heard her. So I think that's beautiful. This little reading is listening from Krista Tippett. Do y'all listen to her podcast on being? Okay, well, you need to. If you take one thing away from tonight, try. It's good, isn't it? It's good stuff, yeah. And it's a variety of things. But this is a quote she talked about generous listening. Listening is an everyday art and virtue, but it's an art we have lost and must learn anew. Listening is more than being quiet while others have their say. It is about presence as much as receiving. It is about connection more than observing. Real listening is powered by curiosity. It involves vulnerability, a willingness to be surprised, to let go of assumptions, and take in ambiguity. It is never in gotcha mode. The generous listener wants to understand the humanity behind the words of the other and patiently summons one's own best self and one's own most generous words and questions. And so I'm sure y'all are trained in that too, about the curiosity part, like, right? To keep it, if it needs to be, if you're talking, you need to be in conversation, can you tell me more? What did that feel like? You know, all the things you get in therapy. If you go to therapy, I do, you don't have to tell me if you do. But I'll be really embarrassed if I'm the only one who does. But that's why I'm so well-rounded, right? Because I have therapy and spiritual direction, I do it all. I do all the things. So that's really, let me just check my notes, what I came to say. And so I told you about being at St. Catherine's. That was where my mother lived. The role of listening in my work. Oh, and I really made myself sound out to not be a very good person, but I'm a pretty nice person. But these are things I've worked on, okay? So I have made progress, I'll just tell you that. You can call my therapist if you want to. But I sometimes, even when I got my best listening heart ears on, okay, I still sometimes want to say something so badly that I might pop. I mean, it's just, I just can't help myself. And so this will sound pitiful, but I sit on my hands if I get like that. And I'm just telling you, it works. That's my signal to myself. You know, it's kind of like when you see kids in the stores and their mothers having to do like this with their arms, right? So they don't touch too much, which I have to do actually too in certain stores. But that has helped me. So if there are any tricks you have, you know, that help you recenter, maybe you take a breath, maybe you do breath work, maybe even that can be enough to give you just that second to recenter, to center down, like theologian Howard Thurman says. I love him. And so that's been helpful for me. What are little things I can do? It's just like anything. If you're in a meeting, or if you're on Zoom and you're, you know, a squirrel passes by and you look out, you just gotta come right back, right? And so the more you do it, the quicker you get about coming back to listening with the ear of your heart. So that's really what I've got. If y'all want to talk, I'd love to have questions, or if y'all want to share any times that you feel that, have you had challenges listening as a Stephen minister, or times, you know? Oh, okay, and then you, okay?
I don't really have anything to say other than
okay.
that,
Oh,
yes,
you have
I've had challenges.
Thank you, an honest one, thank you.
I think it's the hardest thing. I
It is
really
the
do.
hardest thing, and maybe the easy, you know? I mean, it's as hard as just do it, and it's as easy as just do it. That's what I tell my writing clients all the time.
Hal Bungalow, CNN.
Hello, sir. I love your wife.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that, because I love her too.
Yep, she's a keeper.
And she passes along a lot of your wisdom, so I'm glad to hear it firsthand now
Thanks.
from you. I'm glad you mentioned that about sitting, you know, physically sitting on your hands, because I know we're trained to be comfortable with silence, and not many of us are comfortable with more than 10 seconds of silence before we really get antsy. So, how do you think the person, in our case, in our situation, you've been a Stephen minister, so you understand this, how do you think the other person is feeling when nothing's being said? What do you think is typically happening during that period of silence between the caregiver and the care receiver?
Yeah, I think, and this is just from my gut, but I think a couple of things could be happening. I think somebody could say, is this all I get, right? You're not even gonna say anything? Or they could be thinking, thank goodness you're not asking me a bunch of questions or sending me. And I think most of that nervousness is on us. That's what I guess and what I've seen borne out. Because I've caught myself before in spiritual direction, or maybe even in small, you know, getting kind of antsy when the silence goes on too long. That's why I love mindfulness practice, and I like centering prayer. I like anything that trains me to sit still and let go of whatever comes in here. Just send it down the stream for 15 minutes a day. So any kind of individual practice you might do, can help with that. And I think if it just becomes too uncomfortable, I think you might just ask, would you like to talk about what you're thinking or what you're feeling, probably is a better word. So what do y'all think about that? Do you find the silence uncomfortable, or are you talking a lot? Are you listening mode? What do you do?
I felt really convicted, or when you said, I always want to, I think I'm really smart,
Yeah.
so I, feel like I want to tell, something or interject,
Yeah.
and I thought that it was really interesting to say, that's when you interrupt, by interrupting, that you can really,
Maybe enough to shut them down, just
Right.
that one thing, maybe enough. And so I would err on the side of people being uncomfortable with the silence, I think that could get us into trouble if we start to fill the silence too quickly. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Joe Rogers.
Hi, Joel.
I've had a care receiver who really embraced the idea that this was all about him, and so it was yak, yak, yak. I didn't have to do anything but sit and listen,
Yeah.
and he carried it. But I've also had a care receiver or two who were naturally good people interested in me and asked me all sorts of questions about myself. And we're trained to kind of deflect that and to move it back to them. But it's a big challenge for me to not appear abrupt in that circumstance, to try and deflect it back to them, or maybe deflect it in the right word, to comfortably
To
and
reroute it,
smoothly
yeah.
transition back to
Yeah.
them. Any ideas or suggestions for
Yeah,
that
you're
challenge?
just trying to reroute it, you like you said, you're not trying to put up a stop or a huge thing. I don't know, maybe, thank you so much for your kind words. I'd love for us to get back to you because this is your time. I mean, something as simple as that might do it. Or, I'm delighted to know we have that in common. And then maybe ask a question from that to get it back to him. Because, you will need to, I love being complimented and talked about and all that, but you do need to just reroute it. And maybe you even say, they train us this way in spiritual direction, is just to say, let's take a moment of silence, just so everybody can center down a little bit, and then you might open it back up with, what are you feeling, or, so.
What about, there are some care receivers I've had that are pretty practiced, or they're not practiced in even being aware of their story. And I know we can ask open-ended questions and prompts, but some people have never done that exploratory work, and that's real important, particularly if they've come asking for care, because they probably need to go there. Or you have,
And then that's on top of, right, the
Yeah.
reason they came.
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
that is a lot, I think, yeah. And so, of course, it's gonna be easier if it's somebody who's already done a lot of inner work, and is aware of those kinds of things. I don't know, Cheryl, I don't know if, I'm gonna say, ask if they wanna write a little bit, just because that way they wouldn't have to automatically speak it to you, and then they could share that with you on the written, little notebook if they wanted to, or you could, it might at least get them started in
Right.
in learning those kinds of things about themselves, especially if you say it's just for you and the divine, just to help us get a little bit of your story. Or maybe you do have some questions at the end, possibly centered on God, or what's your spiritual story? Tell me more about your spiritual story.
exactly.
And I think once usually I've found that when you do get people talking, they'll
Yeah.
come back around where they need to be.
Right.
But in that situation, I think it's just gonna take longer,
Mhm.
and I think you're just gonna have to be patient.
And I do think writing is, or suggesting for someone, writing is great, and even the morning pages,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't have to be shared with me or anyone else, but it kind of primes the pump.
Mhm. And I think it just helps for people who especially if it's like a first or second time and they're not really sure what this is or something, I just think that's a safer way.
Mhm.
Now, I think everybody in the world should be writing, so I have to watch that, and if people don't wanna do it, but it's certainly a suggestion worth
Sure.
trying, I think, and just see if that helps, Anybody else? Hi.
Hi, I'm Patrick. You mentioned mentioned a couple of times spiritual direction.
Yeah.
And I thought that our training in Stevens was not to be spiritual guides or try to
Right.
direct the care receiver in any particular fashion. How did you utilize that as a Stevens minister, or how did you?
Yeah, I trained in spiritual direction after I did Stephen Minisgtry. And so, yes, I think they're distinct things, but I think they have a lot of overlap. And I guess what I've been trying to show tonight is how so many of the principles I've learned in both affect both, right, can be used in both. But so, yeah, in Stephen Minisgtry, well, in spiritual direction, we're not supposed to tell them what to do either. We're really just supposed to listen to them. And they're mainly talking about their relationship with the divine. A lot of people have been hurt by the church. So I'll see somebody who doesn't really want anything to do with the church, and maybe we talk about some other spiritual paths or practices. So, yeah, they're separate. I just think there's a lot of commonality, especially with the listening piece.
I've got to ask the follow-up to
Okay.
the listening piece. You talk about just taking it in, and when you work with people for a period of time and the conversation is the same, and it just continues to go through a circle, without, asking questions or trying to direct them towards something that looks fairly obvious to me is hard to do, but I wonder how you feel about that, because I think that's may help them see the problem in a different light if they hadn't, thought of that or recognized it. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, and I haven't seen the most recent, I mean, I may be telling you things that fly in the face of Stephen Minisgtry, but I don't think so about the listening for sure. But I know in spiritual direction and the way I remembered, I'm not an active Stephen minister now, but doing that, or any kind of listening ministry, right? I think we can agree they're both listening ministries. And, let me think just a minute. I think the key is questions, actually. And maybe not to bombard them, but I think that's a really lovely way to reroute them, or to get them to go this way instead of this way. Now, we're not telling them they have to go that way, right? We're just asking them to consider going a different way. What about this? Or have you thought about? To me, those are fair questions. I don't want to be not doing Stephen ministry here, but I think those are, because they're about that person, right? You're not saying, here's how I did it, or let me tell you in my situation. So, and I think that's gotta be a challenge if the person is telling the same story over, every time you meet, and you feel like there's no quote unquote progress or growth. That's gotta be a challenge. And I don't know if that person might need something else,
I think the questions work. They
Yeah.
redirect things, and it starts to,
Yeah. Yeah.
starts to unfold a little bit better.
I think that's totally
But
fair.
if you just listen and don't really talk, it's kind of hard to.
Yeah, but I really think with the just listening part means to listen for those things that you can question, right? Just don't be writing them down right in front of, like me, I'd be like getting my notebook out, starring something she said and things like that. So I just had to learn to just slow down. I just have to slow down. But to me, questions, both these, readings on a lot we trained on in both those modalities talk about the curiosity is the way to go, not dogma, right? And I work with a spiritual direction training program now, and it's based in the contemplative Christianity, and the whole thing is about contemplative, compassionate curiosity. So that's the way I look at it when I ask those questions, is compassionate curiosity. So not like this reading said, not a gotcha, or not to see if we're just alike or how different we are, but a curiosity that comes from your soul. So, that's good. Yes, sir?
Steve, I'm glad you mentioned the journaling aspect on it, because that's a very therapeutic thing to pull out for some of these people, because a lot of us are conversationally crippled. We don't, we're introverts, we don't talk a lot to other people, but we avoid them like a plague sometimes. And so if you tell them to just journal it, just write it down, I'm not gonna look at it, but just that helps organize and clarify in their own minds what they're doing, and then you can have a conversation based off that.
And then I think that helps them, and I think it can help the relationship, because because it'll give them somewhere to start and use something to work with if they share some of it with you. And so again, not everybody's gonna dig it, but it works for a lot of people, just to say, how about keeping a little journal of our time together? You know, or do you keep a prayer journal? Do you already keep a spiritual journal? That kind of thing, so, yeah. And I think it can help us as the caregivers to journal about things, to, you know, get through some things, because we're bringing a lot home doing this work, right? And so you gotta have some place to put it. So I think it works on both ends, so. But I know y'all are already doing a good job, you're already trained in this. But I just know when I saw my precious, lonely, widowed, precious mother, I really looked out in the parent department. It's just standing in those hallways and those people, those sweet older women, they were just so hungry for somebody to listen to it from the heart. So that's what I care about, and what I think we do as Stephen ministers, as fellow pilgrims, y'all, as church congregants. So, okay, it's like 7:12, is that good? Oh, it's 7:12.
And I will say that she's got a great website.
Thank you.
Yes, and
Thanks.
a couple of books.
Yeah, I contributed to several books.
Yes.
I have one
Okay,
on my
yeah,
own.
but- yeah, so
Yeah.
check it out.
Yeah.
And then on there, are there dates for like things that you do, workshops or things?
There should be, and there will be soon.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did a one in January for women. We did creative and spiritual resolutions for the new year. We had a ball. So I'm working with Casey Orr to set up some more things like that, some more writing opportunities. And we just did collage. It wasn't fine art, you know, we just had fun. But so I hope to be doing those once a season as a way to get creativity combined with spirituality, because I think they're linked. And I believe that because I think something bigger than me is in the room when I'm making art. Yes, sir.
Just one last question.
Sure.
You mentioned a couple of topics here, but if we're enrolled with a care receiver for a period of time, and they are involved with ministerial support, counseling, legitimate counseling support, and us, and we're all three involved in that, and they start to tell you things that are going on in these other sessions, because they tend to do that, how do you handle that? Do you embrace it, or do you try to keep it separate?
This really sounds like one there might be a right or wrong answer to. I mean, just let me think for just a second. I think I would embrace it at first, and then the more it went on, I think I would try to make the point that we needed to keep those separate. That although you appreciate hearing about this and you're glad they trust you enough to hear these stories, that you're not you're not a therapist, you know? And you know, that it is interesting, because I think all this can bleed together. That's the thing, we get it all the time in spiritual direction, the therapy or the life coach or the, you know, what is this? And I think that that's just a fine line we have to walk. So I don't know what would other people say about that one. I mean, I don't think I'd let that go on for too long, personally, because I don't know that y'all would be getting what you needed. The person would be getting what they needed from you or from God by continuing to repeat that.
We typically start out with permission from the counselors to retain the Stevens minister in the relationship.
Okay.
If they're okay with it,
Yeah.
and the care receiver wants it, then it's okay. But if they don't, we would have to part ways until they, you know, resolve that issue. But but it does come up, and then they open up sometimes and get into a lot
Yeah,
of
and see,
things.
I think that's, I don't really love that, because I think it puts too much on Stephen ministers, really, you know? And so I really wish it were that you weren't allowed to know what they're saying at the therapist, just personally. Because it's hard enough, we're even talking about this for a while tonight, it's hard enough to kind of stay in your lane, right, with so many other modalities out there, like coaching and things like that. So, yeah, that's interesting to me, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer, but that's interesting to me. I would start to feel restless and not offering my best gifts to that person if that repeated every time, that I was getting a rehash of what was done in therapy. Now, if there are pieces of that affects the person's spiritual life, you know, maybe you can glom onto that a little bit, but that's interesting to me about the therapist part. And I don't know if it was that way 15 years ago or not, but it might have been, but yeah. But I think that puts a lot of pressure on y'all.
Do you ever facilitate like the artist way?
Oh, yeah, yeah. We're gonna try to do that here.
That
Yeah, Carol
was
really,
such
Carol and I are
meaning-
cooking something up.
That's such a meaningful.
Yeah, it's a lovely practice if y'all are not familiar with it. Julia Cameron
Mhm.
Jane, you don't know it? Okay, we'll have to
That's
come.
fantastic.
Yeah, what is it?
Be
It
sure
is-
enough.
Yeah.
Her name is
Yeah.
Julia Cameron, she's been around forever, and she's kind of a sage in the creative spiritual world. And she wrote a book called The Artist Way. It's a 12-week, 12 steps program that helps you reclaim your artist, use your voice, know God better, know you better. And it's like, she'll tell you to take an artist date every month and just go to a museum or go to an art store, even if you don't think you're an artist or a writer, because you really are both at some level. And she asks you to do morning pages where you just get up and you just write, don't even think about it, it's just a brain, just kind of get it out of you from the night, don't do anything else first. And some little tips like that. But she's lovely because she also thinks that spirituality and creativity are linked. And she's lived that out.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's fun.
It is a meaningful.
Yeah, and
thing
so
to
Carol
do.
Bungalow and I are trying to work and see about if we might get a group to do that I would facilitate, yeah. So we're
I'm
gonna
in.
work on that. Okay, good. Yeah, oh, good.
Just come back here, tell us about it.
Okay.
We'll have a
Okay.
good foundation.
Thank y'all so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.